My name is Leila Monroe. I remember the exact moment I left home at 19, as vividly as if it happened yesterday. My suitcase felt heavier than it should have, packed hastily with clothes, keepsakes, and whatever courage I could muster. I stood at the edge of our driveway, breathing in the early morning air that smelled faintly of rain. My parents didn't come outside. They didn't wave from the window or even say goodbye as I stepped into the taxi that waited, engine rumbling quietly. Like a patient but indifferent stranger, their silence hurt more than harsh words ever could. Yet, I'd grown accustomed to their disappointment, which had become a bitter undertone of my life. Every dream I ever shared with them seemed ridiculous in their eyes, dismissed with sighs, eye rolls, or worse, cold laughter. Their version of support was always linked to control, conditions, and constant reminders that my ambitions weren't worth pursuing. Marry someone wealthy, Leila, my mother had advised more times than I could count. At least your sister has the right idea. My sister, their golden child, thrived within the lines they'd drawn. She married into wealth, exactly as they'd planned. To them, she'd fulfilled her life's greatest achievement simply by choosing someone who guaranteed stability and comfort. Meanwhile, I was branded the disappointment, the dreamer, wasting her potential on what they deemed fantasies, but those fantasies were the only things I truly owned. My dream of building a business, creating something genuine and personal, sustained me when their dismissive glances and sharp criticisms threatened to break me. Every whispered doubt fueled my determination, igniting a quiet rebellion inside my chest. The day I left, I barely had $100 in my bank account. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start over, to prove them wrong, to prove myself capable. I'd never been more terrified or determined. As the taxi drove away, I resisted the urge to glance back. I wouldn't give myself the chance to reconsider. Moving forward was the only way I knew I'd survive. My small apartment was sparse, furnished with a thrifted couch, a tiny table, and a sense of unyielding hope. Those first months alone were a blur of long hours working minimum wage jobs, barely scraping by, and sleepless nights where anxiety would creep in, whispering doubt into my resolve. But each morning, I woke determined. I clung fiercely to my vision of independence and success, a dream rooted deeply in my own values and not in anyone else's expectations. There were days I longed to call home, to reach out for comfort, hoping against hope that they'd softened, that they'd begun to see me differently. But I quickly learned that expecting kindness or acceptance from my parents was a lesson in disappointment. So, I began to build walls, not out of bitterness, but necessity. I created a shield around my heart to protect the fragile hope I nurtured daily, refusing to let their negativity penetrate my new, hard-earned independence, and gradually, though painfully, I learned to rely solely on myself. It wasn't about proving them wrong, not entirely. It was about finding strength in solitude, believing in dreams no one else dared to validate. This departure was more than physical. It was emotional, psychological. It was the first step toward finding peace and discovering who I could become. When I finally allowed myself to thrive away from their shadows, those early days of independence were anything but easy. I'd wake up in my small apartment, the morning sun casting gentle golden hues across cracked walls and a faded carpet. I'd savor a few minutes of quiet, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, knowing the peace wouldn't last. Then reality would set in, pressing heavy against my chest as I faced another day of juggling too much work and too little pay. I took any job I could find, waiting tables, washing dishes, even cleaning homes on weekends. My feet constantly ached, blisters turning to calluses beneath worn-out shoes. But there was something fiercely satisfying in working so hard. Each hour spent working meant one step further from the expectations of parents who never believed in me. Each hard-earned dollar felt like quiet proof that I could make it, even if they never saw it or acknowledged it. At night, I'd come home, exhausted to my bones. I'd lean against my kitchen counter, the ache of loneliness sometimes sharper than the physical pain. I'd eat leftover food brought home from shifts at the restaurant, the flavor dulled by weariness. Yet even in those exhausted moments, I found a quiet kind of hope. It was buried beneath my fatigue, like an ember waiting for a breath to ignite it. Late at night, beneath the yellow glow of my lamp, I'd sit with my laptop, typing away at my tiny kitchen table. My online business started small, selling handcrafted goods I'd make in rare spare moments. It was humble, maybe even laughable to someone like my parents. But for me, it was my first real step toward freedom. Each product sold felt like an affirmation, a sign that perhaps there was a place for me in the world beyond my parents' harsh predictions. Slowly, my tiny business began to grow. Friends started sharing my products online. Word of mouth became my greatest ally. A modest following developed, people who connected with my story, who believed in supporting something personal and genuine. Every positive comment or glowing review was balm to old wounds, gently reminding me of the worth I'd always struggled to recognize. Yet the road was far from smooth. There were setbacks, days when no sales came through, when bills stacked up ominously, when panic whispered cruelly in my ear that my parents had been right. On those dark days, I'd sit alone, fighting the urge to give up, feeling the sting of tears in my eyes. But even then, somewhere deep inside, stubbornness or pride or sheer determination forced me forward. I wasn't ready to surrender my dreams, not yet, not ever. Through every challenge, I learned resilience. I began to trust my own voice, my intuition guiding me through uncertainty. I stopped seeking external validation from people who'd already proven they weren't capable of giving it. Instead, I found strength in the small victories I earned on my own terms, in quiet moments of pride that belonged only to me. It wasn't a glamorous life. It wasn't even particularly happy at times. But amidst the hustle, hardship, and relentless exhaustion, hope quietly flourished. Each small step forward was a promise to myself, to my dreams, that I could become something beyond their limited expectations. And as the months passed, I felt something shift within me. The hope that had started fragile and timid began to solidify into confidence. I hadn't just survived their rejection. I'd begun to thrive, slowly proving to myself that I was strong enough, smart enough, brave enough to find my own way, even if I had to do it alone. Months turned into years, and little by little, the business I'd built from sheer determination began to flourish. The tiny corner of my apartment that had once felt too empty was now filled with neatly packed boxes, product samples, and stacks of shipping labels. The silence that had been my constant companion was slowly replaced by the gentle chime of new orders coming in. Each notification brought a rush of excitement, a reminder that I'd somehow created something meaningful out of nothing. But more than sales figures or reviews, it was the stories behind each customer that touched me deeply. Emails would trickle in from strangers who'd stumbled across my website and felt connected to my products and even to me. They told me how my creations brought them comfort or reminded them of cherished memories. They didn't know my personal struggles or how hard I'd fought for every success, yet their words filled me with warmth and validation I'd never known from my own family. Still, the journey wasn't without its struggles. With success came new challenges, anxieties I hadn't anticipated. Managing inventory, dealing with suppliers, navigating the intricacies of taxes. Every step forward seemed to come with a steep learning curve. There were days when everything felt overwhelming, when the pressure pressed down heavily on my shoulders, whispering doubts I thought I'd silenced long ago. On those difficult days, I sometimes found myself instinctively reaching for the phone, almost dialing my parents' number. Old habits, deeply ingrained, die slowly. I'd long for some reassurance, just a few kind words to steady me when my resolve felt shaky. But I always stopped myself, remembering clearly their cold dismissal of my dreams. Instead, I'd breathe deep, reminding myself that their approval wasn't mine to chase. It never had been. So, I learned to trust myself more deeply. I reached out to mentors, online communities, people who had walked similar paths and genuinely understood the daily trials of running a small business alone. I built a new network, a chosen family of sorts who celebrated each small victory and stood by me through setbacks. This circle became my anchor, a source of support my birth family had never provided. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day spent managing orders and customer queries, I received an email that stood apart from the rest. It came from an investor, someone who had been quietly observing my journey. They praised my brand's authenticity and the personal story that resonated through each product. And then came an offer,
My hands
an opportunity
shook as I
to
read
expand
and
beyond
reread the
anything
email,
I'd ever
disbelief
imagined, giving way to quiet excitement. This wasn't just validation. It was the possibility of true security, a chance to take my dreams to heights I'd hardly allowed myself to envision. I'd built something from scratch against every doubt and criticism I'd faced, and here was proof, tangible and real, that I had done something remarkable. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, tears slipped silently down my face, not from sadness but relief. All the struggle, the loneliness, the quiet, stubborn hope had brought me here, to a place of possibility and pride I'd long thought unattainable. The old wounds still lingered, scars faded but never completely erased. Yet now, they felt purposeful. They had shaped me, pushed me, strengthened me into someone I was proud to be. Success was more than financial stability. It was knowing I had remained true to myself, even when everyone else had doubted me. For the first time, I felt truly capable. My parents' judgments no longer held power over me. Instead, I'd found strength within my own story, quietly triumphant, ready to embrace whatever came next. The offer from the investor came at a time when I was just starting to feel comfortable with the rhythm of my life. My days no longer felt like a constant sprint to survive. I had learned how to manage my time, handle orders, and even take a day off every now and then without spiraling into panic. The business was solid, the growth steady, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't dominated by fear. But when the email arrived, everything shifted. The offer was everything I never dared to ask for: an opportunity to scale my brand, expand into retail, and even branch into new product lines. This wasn't just someone offering financial backing. It was a vote of confidence. Someone saw potential in me, in what I had built with nothing but sweat, tears, and the stubborn belief that I could create something meaningful. At first, I couldn't breathe. I sat at my desk, staring at the words, willing myself to comprehend them. The potential was overwhelming. To think this was the same Leila Monroe who once stood in front of a restaurant kitchen sink, scrubbing dishes for tips, with nothing but a pile of unpaid bills and a heart full of doubt. Now, someone believed in my brand, in my vision, enough to make a move like this. But with that belief came pressure, immense, suffocating pressure. I knew I couldn't accept the offer lightly. My small business had been my lifeline, my refuge from everything that had once hurt me. It was where I had poured every ounce of myself, every fear and every hope. The idea of handing over a portion of my dream to someone else, of letting someone else have a say in its direction, was terrifying. I sat with the offer for days, weighing every possibility. Could I trust this investor? Could I handle the responsibility of such a huge leap? Would it change everything I had worked so hard to build? And most importantly, would it be worth it? I had learned to thrive on my own, to carve a path without needing validation from anyone, but this was different. This was an opportunity that could elevate me, but also potentially swallow me whole if I wasn't careful. I consulted my mentors, the ones who had been with me through the small victories and the sleepless nights. Their support was unwavering. They didn't push me toward any decision but offered their wisdom, reminding me of the lessons I had learned along the way. "You've already proven you can do this on your own," one of them told me. "Now, it's about choosing how far you want to go." In the end, after countless sleepless nights of pondering, I accepted. But it wasn't a decision driven by ambition alone, it was the culmination of years of learning to trust myself. I wasn't accepting this offer to prove anything to my parents or anyone else. I was doing it because I believed in what I had created, and I knew I was ready to see it grow, even if it meant taking risks I had never considered before. The day I signed the deal, a weight lifted off my chest, but a new one settled in its place. It wasn't the weight of doubt anymore, it was the weight of possibility, of ambition, of the unknown. I was about to step into a new phase of my life, and I was terrified. But beneath the fear, there was something stronger: hope, quietly, defiant, saying that I was ready. Returning to the place where it all started felt surreal. I hadn't planned on coming back, not really. When I first left home at 19, I was determined never to return. I wasn't just escaping the confines of my parents' expectations. I was running towards something better, something that was all my own. But life has a funny way of leading you back to the places you once thought you'd outgrown. The restaurant where I had worked all those years ago was more than just a job for me. It was where I learned the hard work, patience, and humility that have carried me through my journey. I was just a waitress then, doing everything I could to make ends meet, hoping one day I'd be able to create something of my own. I didn't have a grand plan back then. I didn't even know if I could ever escape the cycle of struggling, hoping, dreaming. But working there, surrounded by the bustle of waiters and cooks, I had always felt like there was more to life than the one I had been handed, and now here I was, not just returning to that place, but taking ownership of it. It wasn't just a restaurant to me. It was a symbol of my grit, my perseverance. It represented all the years of quiet struggle, the nights I stayed up until perfecting a business plan, all the lonely hours I spent learning how to build something from nothing. The idea of buying this place wasn't just about making money or owning a piece of property, it was about reclaiming something from my past and making it mine in the most profound way I could think of. When I first stepped into the building after signing the papers, it felt almost unreal. The same walls, the same smell of sizzling food and rich coffee, the same worn floors that had once been my stage, now felt like home in a different way. I could hear the voices of the old staff echoing in my head, their laughter, their complaints, their camaraderie. And then there was the undeniable sound of success in the air, a quiet hum that seemed to come from deep within the bones of the restaurant. I had already made plans to improve the space, to restore the kitchen, update the decor, and enhance the menu, but I wanted to honor the history of the place too. It was where I'd learned what it meant to work hard, to serve others, to give without expecting anything in return. It was where I had learned what it meant to fight for what you wanted, even when everyone around you seemed to be laughing at your dreams. I didn't buy the restaurant to impress anyone, not even my parents, but there was a part of me that couldn't help but imagine what it would be like to have them walk through those doors one day, their faces registering shock as they realized just how far I had come. I had spent years convincing myself that their approval didn't matter, but deep down, I still wondered what it would feel like if they finally saw me for who I had become. If they finally understood that the quiet woman they dismissed as a failure had built something worthy, something real, on her own. But owning the restaurant wasn't just about them or their approval, it was about me. It was a testament to everything I had fought for, every late night I spent worrying over bills, every lonely stretch of road that led me to this moment. I had worked tirelessly for everything I had achieved, and now I could look at the place that once felt like a distant dream and say, I did this. And so, in that moment, standing in the middle of the restaurant, I felt the weight of the past lift just a little more. It was a symbol of redemption, of self-made success, of proving that you could rise from nothing, even if the world or your family had written you off long ago. This wasn't just a business venture. It was proof to myself that I could carve my own path without needing anyone's permission or validation. For the first time in a long while, I stood there not looking back at the years of struggle, but forward toward all the possibilities ahead. This was my moment, not for them, not for anyone else, but for me. And in that stillness, I realized I was exactly where I was meant to be. I hadn't spoken to my parents in over a year. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It had become the backdrop of my life, a quiet understanding that we each lived in our own worlds, worlds that barely touched. But for some reason, as the restaurant began to take shape and my confidence grew, I found myself considering them again. The thought of them seeing what I had built, seeing me as someone other than their failure, planted itself in my mind. I never expected them to apologize. I never expected them to suddenly shower me with the praise I had longed for as a child. No, this wasn't about them changing. It was about me, about showing them that I had become something they could never have imagined, no matter how hard they tried to push me into a mold that didn't fit. So, I made the decision to invite them to dinner. I chose the restaurant, my restaurant, carefully. It wasn't just about impressing them. It was about making a statement. This was my success, and I wanted them to see it. The menu was set, the staff was briefed, and everything was prepared for what I hoped would be a simple, quiet evening. When they walked in, late as usual, their presence filled the room. My mother, impeccably dressed in a gown that seemed more suited for a gala than a dinner with her estranged daughter, scanned the room with the same cool detachment she always had. My father, as usual, barely spared me a glance as he slid into the seat across from me, his eyes already on the menu, as if this evening was nothing more than another obligation to check off. Their dismissive air was familiar, almost comforting. In its predictability, I had long accepted it, but tonight I wasn't the same girl they had once scorned. I wasn't looking for their approval, and I wasn't waiting for their validation. I had already learned to live without it. Still, a small part of me, perhaps the part I had tried so hard to bury, couldn't help but wonder if, for once, they might see me. Really see me. The conversation, as expected, started awkwardly. They asked me about my business in a tone that suggested they didn't believe it could be anything worth discussing. My mother glanced at the menu and, with the kind of icy politeness I knew so well, asked, "Are you sure you can afford this place, Leela? We don't want you washing dishes after dinner." The words landed like a slap, the old sting shooting through me. For a brief moment, I wanted to snap back, to tell them how small they were, how much I had accomplished without them. But instead, I smiled, a tight smile, and said nothing. The words no longer had power over me. I had long since stopped seeking their approval, and the bitterness no longer tasted sweet. I was different now, stronger, more at peace with who I had become. Before I could even respond, the waiter approached, a warm smile on his face as he greeted us. "Welcome back, Miss Monroe," he said. His voice carried a kind of reverence that was impossible to ignore. "The staff's been looking forward to your visit. The executive team asked me to personally thank you for everything you've done. Would you like to see the updated wine cellar before dinner?" My parents froze, their eyes darting from the waiter to each other in confusion. My mother blinked, clearly thrown off balance by the way the staff seemed to know me. She turned back to me, her voice laced with disbelief. "Why would the staff care who you are?" The waiter smiled gently, as though answering a question he'd heard 100 times. "She owns the restaurant. Didn't she tell you?" Silence. The kind of silence that fills the air when the world shifts beneath you, and you realize that everything you thought you knew is suddenly in question. My parents' faces went pale. My father, who had barely acknowledged me since he'd sat down, now stared at me in stunned silence, as if he couldn't comprehend the words he had just heard. My mother's face was a mixture of disbelief and barely concealed horror. The air felt heavy between us, thick with the weight of their realization. I didn't need to say anything. The truth had spoken for me. I didn't buy the restaurant to make them proud. I didn't buy it to make a statement to them or to anyone. I bought it because it represented something I had worked for, something that meant more to me than anything they could ever offer. It was about proving to myself that I was capable, that I could build something of my own, no matter how small they had made me feel, but seeing their reactions, the way they shrank into their seats, unable to meet my eyes, told me everything I needed to know. They had never believed in me. They still didn't. And yet, here I was, standing in the midst of their disbelief, not seeking forgiveness, not seeking validation, but simply standing firm in the truth of who I had become. I wasn't angry anymore. In fact, as I looked at them sitting there, so small in their disbelief, I felt something unexpected: peace. Real peace. Not because they had changed, not because they suddenly understood me, but because I no longer needed them to. I had learned to believe in myself even when they didn't, and that, I realized, was more powerful than anything they could have ever given me. The silence hung thick between us, suffocating. My parents had no words left to say. They stared at me as if I were someone they didn't recognize. There was no anger, no outrage, just a strange, almost tragic kind of stillness. It was the same silence they had always offered me when they didn't have an answer to my existence, when they couldn't explain why my dreams didn't fit into their narrow vision of success. I sat back, my hands folded on the table in front of me, watching the confusion play across their faces. They hadn't expected this. I had prepared myself for their judgment, their dismissive remarks, their condescension. But I had never imagined they would be so utterly speechless. My mother's lips parted, then closed again, as though she was searching for the right words that might fix the mess of emotions swirling inside her. She didn't want to admit it, but the shock on her face was impossible to hide. She had never believed I could do anything of significance. She had never once looked at me and seen the possibility of greatness. And now, here I was, quietly successful, no longer the little girl she had dismissed, but someone who had carved her own path despite every attempt to crush my spirit. She cleared her throat, but the words came out stilted. You own this place?" I nodded, my voice steady. "Yes, Mom. I bought it." Her gaze darted nervously toward my father, but he was still staring at me, his face pale, his lips pursed. It was as if they couldn't quite process it, as if the idea that I had managed to accomplish something on my own, without their support, without their belief, was a concept too foreign to accept. My father finally shifted in his seat, glancing at the menu as if the items on it were suddenly of the utmost importance. "Well, that's unexpected," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "I didn't think you had it in you." I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. I wanted to shout, to let the years of hurt and frustration spill out, to let them feel the weight of the years they had made me feel invisible, insignificant. But I didn't, because the truth was, I had already healed. Their words, their doubts, they no longer had the power to hurt me the way they once did. Instead, I smiled softly, a quiet, knowing smile that held no malice, no anger. "I guess you never really knew me, did you?" They exchanged a glance, and I saw something flicker in my father's eyes, something close to regret, but it was gone before I could really read it. He sighed and set the menu down, as if he'd given up trying to control the situation. My mother, still processing, couldn't quite bring herself to look me in the eye. "Well," she said, her voice soft, uncertain, "I suppose this is impressive. But Leela," she hesitated, as if searching for the right thing to say, the thing that could pull everything back into their comfort zone. "You could have had a much easier life. You could have married well. You could have." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice firm but quiet. "Don't tell me what I could have done. I'm doing exactly what I've always wanted to do, and I didn't need anyone's approval to get here." The words hung in the air, more powerful than any confrontation I'd imagined. My mother's mouth opened, but no sound came out. My father, who had always prided himself on his rationality, simply stared at me, as if seeing me for the first time in years, perhaps for the first time ever, and in that moment, I realized something that shook me to my core. I didn't need them to see me. I didn't need them to finally recognize my worth, because I had already done that for myself. I had long since accepted the person I had become, and the woman sitting across from them wasn't a little girl looking for approval. She was someone who had survived their rejection and built something beautiful from the wreckage. I watched them sit in silence, their minds struggling to catch up to a reality they had never imagined. They didn't know how to process it, how to reconcile the daughter they had dismissed with the woman who had quietly succeeded in spite of them. For the first time in my life, I didn't care. Their silence, their discomfort, it was no longer mine to carry. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was simply free. We ate in silence for the rest of the meal. The tension didn't lift, but I didn't mind. In some strange way, I realized I had already won. Not because I had proven them wrong, but because I had proven something to myself. I had built a life they couldn't even begin to understand, and I didn't need them to validate it. It was enough to know that I had arrived at this place on my own terms, without the weight of their judgment holding me back. I had finally arrived at a place of peace, quiet and unshakable, and nothing they said or didn't say could take that from me. The meal ended in a muted, uncomfortable sort of quiet, the kind that lingers when no one knows how to bridge the gap that has suddenly opened between them. My parents ate without speaking much more. Their words were polite but distant, devoid of the usual sharp edge that had marked so many of our interactions in the past. The world around us hummed with the familiar sounds of the restaurant, forks clinking against plates, quiet conversations drifting by, but in our small corner, time seemed to have slowed down. I had come to dinner with the hope that maybe, just maybe, they would look at me differently. I had imagined some kind of acknowledgement, a small spark of pride in their eyes, a quiet recognition of the work I had done, of the life I had built. But that didn't come, not in any obvious way. My mother's eyes never truly met mine for longer than a second, her gaze flicking nervously to the wine glass in front of her. My father had barely spoken, his responses brief, as though he couldn't quite find the right words, or maybe he just didn't know what to say anymore. But as the evening wore on, I began to realize something profound. I didn't need them to see me. I didn't need their acknowledgement or approval. I had spent so many years fighting for their validation, pouring my energy into trying to be something they could accept, something that would make them proud. But I had long since outgrown that need. It wasn't about them anymore. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about me. By the time dessert arrived, I had settled into a quiet understanding. My parents weren't going to change. They were never going to see me the way I had once hoped they would. They weren't capable of understanding the depth of what I had done, of the struggles I had faced and the victories I had quietly celebrated. But that was okay. The truth had already spoken for me. I had built something real, something powerful, and it was mine, not theirs to approve or disapprove of. The realization was both freeing and bittersweet. A part of me had held out hope, had clung to the dream of one day hearing them say, "We're proud of you, Leela," but that wasn't going to happen, and I was finally at peace with that. The need to be validated by them had been replaced with the quiet, solid certainty that I had validated myself. I was proud of me, and that had to be enough. When the bill came, I paid without hesitation, handing over my credit card with a calm sense of finality. As the waiter collected the payment and disappeared into the back of the restaurant, I looked at my parents. They were still silent, both lost in their own thoughts, the tension thick between us. I didn't feel the sting of their rejection anymore. It had faded, replaced by a calm, quiet strength. The sting had once been a searing ache, but now it was just a scar, a reminder of the years of growth, of the woman I had become despite their refusal to see me. "I should probably get going," I said, my voice breaking the silence. I wasn't in a hurry, but I knew that there was no point in dragging out a conversation that wasn't going to happen. I stood up, taking a moment to let the weight of the evening settle in. They both stood as well, their movements slow, their expressions unreadable. We didn't hug. We didn't exchange words of regret or apology. My mother reached out, placing her hand on my arm briefly, but it was more out of obligation than anything else. There was no warmth in the gesture, no genuine connection. I nodded at them, a soft, almost imperceptible smile playing on my lips. "Take care of yourselves," I said quietly, and I meant it. Despite everything, I wanted them to be well. But I knew now that I couldn't carry their disappointment with me anymore. As I turned and walked out of the restaurant, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The evening had been the culmination of everything I had worked for, not for them, but for myself. I stepped out into the cool night air, the streets outside the restaurant still bustling with life. And for the first time in a long while, I felt truly free. I had built this life, this success, not by their standards, not with their approval, but by my own. And that was enough. I didn't need their validation to know that I had made it. I had already won, and that victory was all mine. As I walked away from the restaurant, the cool evening breeze kissed my face, but it wasn't enough to shake the sense of calm that had settled deep within me. The night felt different now, quieter, even though the world around me buzzed with the normality of city life. People passed by, oblivious to the turning point that had just occurred in my life. The hum of conversations, the sound of tires on wet streets, the distant laughter, everything continued as usual. But I had changed. I could feel it. The weight of everything I had achieved, every late night, every sleepless hour spent obsessing over my dreams, every lonely moment when I thought it would never happen. All of that had led to this moment, the quiet moment of knowing that I had finally reached the place I had fought so hard to find. A place where I no longer needed anyone's approval, no longer sought validation from the people who should have supported me the most. I had built this life on my own terms, and there was nothing more empowering than that. I didn't need the world to acknowledge it, didn't need my parents to come to terms with it. The truth had already spoken for itself. I had earned this. I had taken every rejection, every unspoken judgment, every moment of doubt, and turned it into fuel. I had learned to use their indifference as motivation, not as a reason to shrink or hide, but as a reason to grow, to push myself beyond what anyone thought was possible. There was no fanfare, no grand declarations. It wasn't loud or in your face. My success wasn't about showing anyone what I could do. It wasn't about revenge or proving anything to those who had doubted me. It was about the quiet, steadfast belief that I could do it, and then doing it. As I made my way down the streets that had once felt so foreign, so full of fear and uncertainty, I realized that everything had come full circle. I had come full circle. The girl who left home at 19, armed with nothing but a suitcase and the dream of something more, had become a woman who now stood on her own 2 feet, with a life of her own making. I could feel the pride swelling inside me, but it wasn't loud or desperate. It wasn't something I needed to shout from the rooftops or flaunt in anyone's face. It was a quiet pride, the kind that comes when you know, deep in your bones, that you've done something meaningful, something real, something worthy of your own love and respect. I wasn't angry at my parents anymore. The bitterness that had once been a constant companion had melted away, replaced by a sense of calm I had never known. I realized that I didn't need them to see me. I didn't need them to approve of me. I didn't need them at all to feel complete. What I needed was already within me. I had made peace with myself. I had found the quiet strength to forgive them, even without their apology. I had moved on from the hurt they had caused, from the years of rejection, from the lies they had told me about who I was. I had learned to forgive them, but more importantly, I had learned to forgive myself for ever thinking I needed them to define my worth. I stopped on the sidewalk and looked up at the stars scattered across the night sky. The city lights blurred them out, but I could still see their presence, steady and constant. I had been like those stars for so long, hidden behind clouds, unnoticed, just waiting for the right moment to shine through. And now here I was. There was no applause, no loud cheers, but I didn't need any of that. I had arrived quietly, on my own terms, and in that moment, I knew that the real victory had nothing to do with my parents or anyone else. The victory had always been about me learning to believe in myself, to trust my own voice, to carve out a life that was mine and mine alone. As I continued walking through the city streets, a sense of peace washed over me. For the first time in years, I was free, not just free from the shackles of their expectations, but free in the truest sense of the word. I had built a life that no one could take away from me. I had fought for this, and now I could enjoy the quiet triumph that came with knowing I had done it all on my own. This was my moment. Quiet, unassuming, but powerful. And it was enough. The days after that dinner passed quietly, and with them, the noise of my past slowly faded into a background hum. I found myself in a new rhythm, one that no longer echoed with the uncertainty or anger that had once defined my life. It wasn't that the memories of my parents or the pain they caused me disappeared completely. They were there, but they no longer held any power over me. What I had learned at dinner, in that quiet revelation, was that their approval didn't define me anymore. It never had. I woke up every morning to a life that felt mine, truly mine. The restaurant was thriving, a place where I had poured my heart and soul into every detail. I had surrounded myself with people who believed in the same things I did: integrity, quality, and second chances, and together, we built something real. I was no longer the girl who had to fight for every inch of space in a world that didn't see her. I was the woman who had taken her place in it, unapologetically, without needing anyone to stand behind her. My days were spent making decisions, navigating the challenges of business, and forging connections with people who respected and supported my vision. There was still a long way to go, still plenty of obstacles to face, but the difference now was that I knew I could handle them. I didn't need anyone to tell me I could do it. I already knew, and for the first time in my life, I felt at home, in my own skin. The girl who had once longed for her parents' approval, the one who had silently begged for their validation, had vanished. She was gone, replaced by a woman who understood her own worth. The approval I had once sought from others now came from within. It wasn't the loud, brash kind of self-assurance you might see in a movie. It was quieter, deeper. It was peace. I found myself letting go of old grudges, not because they didn't matter, but because they no longer had the power to shape me. The weight of years spent trying to prove myself, years spent measuring my success by someone else's standards, had finally lifted. I had nothing to prove anymore, not to my parents, not to anyone. The only person I needed to prove anything to was myself, and that had already been done. I started to trust in the possibilities ahead. I knew there would be more challenges, more moments of doubt and difficulty, but I no longer feared them. They were just part of the journey now, no longer something to avoid or dread. I could face them with the quiet strength I had cultivated, knowing that every step, no matter how small, brought me closer to the person I was meant to be. There was a freedom in that, a freedom that came not from escaping my past, but from accepting it. I had learned to carry my history without letting it define me. It had shaped me, yes, but it no longer controlled me. The girl who once felt small and insignificant now stood tall, a woman who had fought for every ounce of her happiness and success. One afternoon, while walking through the restaurant, a sense of gratitude washed over me. I looked at the staff, the place I had built with my own hands, the customers who came and went, leaving with smiles on their faces, and I felt something deep inside: peace. Real, unshakable peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from everything being perfect. It was the kind that comes when you finally make peace with yourself. When you stop asking for permission, when you stop waiting for validation from others, and when you learn that you are enough, just as you are. I didn't need my parents to understand me. I didn't need them to see me as the success I had become. I had already seen it in myself, and that was more than enough. As I stood there, taking it all in: the noise, the laughter, the smell of good food in the air, I knew that this was only the beginning. The future stretched out before me, uncertain, yes, but full of promise. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what it might bring. I was ready, because I had learned the most important lesson of all, to believe in myself. And in that belief, I had found something far more valuable than success or approval. I had found peace, and with that peace, everything else fell into place.